Next person we're bringing up is Jim Thrailkill. He's the supervisor of the Roseburg Field Office for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's going to talk about the Endangered Species Act perspective on critical habitat designation and management. So help me welcome Jim while I get his talk up.
Well, good morning, everybody. And for the next, there'll be a progression here where I'll start out kind of laying the groundwork, kind of crawling under the hood of the Endangered Species Act and letting you know kind of the formative things that we did to develop the rule. And then Brian's going to follow with the modeling aspects in terms of the reserves, the composite maps that were put together, and how that played out through the modeling process. And then Brendan and Bruce will follow up with kind of the implementation aspects of it. So that's what's ahead of us here. The folks that are listed here on the screen, these people were the primary, the core folks, if you will, of helping to develop the proposed rule. And there was across agencies, across organizations, a lot of work to combine a lot of different skill sets to come in to help us put this together. And the title of the talk is Reconciling Northern Spotted Owl Critical Habitat with Principles of Conservation Planning. So the question is, why do we think we have to reconcile this? Well, for a number of reasons. One is that over the last decades or so, we've had great advances in population modeling, habitat mapping, habitat modeling, the technology that allows us to do all that stuff. And so we made great strides in being able to have pretty much robust conservation planning. And I think the Northwest Forest Plan and the monitoring report that comes out every 5 years is a great example of some of that work and the advances that we've been able to make. If you read conservation biology, there's large-scale planning efforts going on that use a lot of the latest thinking in conservation planning. So we've got great advances. But you juxtapose that against the Endangered Species Act, and in particular the critical habitat portion of that. And the act was promulgated in 1973, and so since that time there hasn't been really any updates to the act. There's been a lot of court opinions and rulings on various provisions of that act, and so our challenge with that is today, how do we blend, how do we integrate the latest in conservation thinking with provisions of the act, and how do we blend that effectively? And part of what we wanted to do here, I think primarily what we wanted to do, and Paul referred to this, was that we're interested in ecosystems, ecosystem structure, ecosystem processes. And Section 2 of the Act says that we need to provide a means whereby ecosystems upon threatened and endangered species depend may be conserved. And so our primary objective was trying to get at that through this process. So as you'll hear in Brian's talk, there was essentially three steps that we used to get at finalizing the proposed rule and the conservation benefits there. And so we used a three-step process. One was habitat suitability modeling, and then moving that over into optimization, if you will, of habitat and where that is from a conservation prioritization model using zonation, and then putting it through different planning scenarios, if you will, habitat management scenarios, and then feeding that into HECSIM, which is a population model, and then having this feedback loop into, okay, well, how do these various scenarios play out? And so what we're interested in doing, and Brian will talk a bit more about this, is not necessarily what is the future population trend through this effort. We really can't do that very well, but what we wanted to do is kind of relativize, okay, well, how does one scenario compare relativized to the next one, and so how is that performance from one option, if you will, to the next. And so our challenge again was to try to do that within the statutory definitions of what is provided under the Endangered Species Act. So the Act, this is right straight out of the Act, this is cut and pasted from there, and this is the statutory definition of critical habitat. And as you read through that, what I want you to kind of be aware of is that most every word in there has from either conserve or geographical area to occupied, those have been defined and redefined in policy and court decisions through time. And so all in an attempt, if you will, to try to meet whatever the intent of Congress was when they put this together. And so our efforts were focused on a subset of these elements that are contained here that are directly associated with our evaluation and modeling effort. And so again, we're trying to align things with conservation planning to various provisions here. And I want to kind of distill that down and have you focus on just three of those provisions. And the first one here is specific areas within the geographical area occupied by the species at the time of listing. And so, as Betsy laid out, the owl was listed in 1990, and then and through time we've had a great, a great accumulation of data. But the Act says where was it at the time of listing? What did we know from the extent of its range? And that's what we'll use to help figure out where occupancy is. And then we'll have that as kind of a base map, if you will, to start from. And then from there, where are those areas that contain the physical and biological features that are essential to the conservation of the species? And so what this is trying to get at is essentially what is the life history processes, the life stages of the species that we need to be focused on and then tailor our conservation efforts to. So that's the second part of that. And then the third is, and these are all kind of tied together, is that, okay, well, where do we need to focus our areas from what we would call in a special management or protection considerations for within that larger geographic area. And so I'm going to step through each of these three things here a little bit more in detail. So just in general terms, the physical and biological features, I'm going to be referring to these as PBFs. And you'll hear that through the talk, and you also hear about primary constituent elements. Those are two different things, and the second one's the PCEs. So in general terms, the physical and biological features include but aren't limited to the following things. And so we've got space for individual growth and population growth, and something that would provide for normal behavior of the species. And then we've got food, water, air, light, and those things, and other physical requirements that the species would need. And then we've got cover and shelter, of course, that the critters would need. And then we've got sites for breeding, rearing, reproduction, germination, those type of things. And then lastly, in a general sense, from a physical and biological features consideration, we've got habitats that are protected. And this is habitats that are protected from disturbance or represent the historical, geographical, or ecological distribution of the species. And so these are the things that we need to kind of blend together as we're looking to develop the rule and have it aligned to the statute. So when you step that down to, okay, what does that really mean for spotted owls in this context? Again, back to the space, food, cover, breeding sites, etc. So to get at that question, and as Betsy laid out, we've got fortunately decades of research on the spotted owl. And so we can bring all that information to bear to help us get to that answer to this question. And we also recognize through all that research that while the owl is a habitat specialist, it does have some plasticity, if you will, that we know that it uses a broad array of habitat types. And that's probably largely driven by its wide geographical area across the three states. And so it's that information combined with the modeling approach that we will be talking about, where we were able to identify features, those features on the landscape, the food, the cover, the shelter, and use that and then help develop a reserve design across the landscape that at best incorporates all those features together. And so when we put that all together, essentially what we came down to, and it's pretty simplistic, but the physical and biological features are those forest lands that can be used for nesting, roosting, foraging, and dispersal. So then from there, okay, so that's the first part of the Act that we needed to kind of align to. And the second part is down to the primary constituent elements, the PCEs. You may have heard that acronym. And And basically, the PCEs kind of help inform the PBFs. And so, in the case of the spotted owl, well, let me back up and say in a general sense, the PCEs would be like roost sites, nesting grounds, spawning grounds for animals. And then in the case of the spotted owl, we translate those forest lands and those PBFs to the PCEs. And here we're saying, well, it's those areas that, those forest types that can support nesting, roosting, foraging, and dispersal. And dispersal in this sense would be the colonization and transience phase that the owls go through, particularly in the early portion of their lives. Now, part of the PCEs, besides just these forest types, there's also kind of the amount and arrangement that we need to be considering. And so not only do we have these within stand considerations of the forest types in terms of the structure of the stand and how that's arranged, but we also got to be give consideration to across the landscape how that is arranged, because we want to make sure that we've got population persistence that's going to occur as a result of the reserve design. And so not only do you have the kind of the biotic features going on there, but we need to have those arranged in space and time. So to kind of put that all together, we had nesting, roosting habitat, and then foraging habitat. And if you've gone through consultation, you've heard about PCE2, PCE3, PCE4. PCE2 is the nesting, roosting habitat, and then 3 is foraging, and then 4 is kind of the connectivity, the dispersal aspect of it. And so what you have is basically a whole host of biotic factors, which is the habitat. And we know that there's this interaction that goes on, that the expression of the habitat has got to be through the abiotic features that we have out there in terms of the soil types. It gets back to the climate, to the elevation, to the topography. And so, and then again, that's translated across scale. And so we know that, like Betsy said, owls are highly territorial. So they've got the specific areas that they seem to use year after year. And then if you move that up through space, from the territory scale all the way up to the range-wide distribution. And so our charge under the ESA was trying to put that together and that interaction of those things. And kind of more visually to represent some of this, you can see there on your left, and Betsy showed this, was that we know that the birds will use areas in a particular way. And so when we were putting things together, we asked ourselves, well, what's the most meaningful scale for owls in terms of their use patterns? And it's that half-mile core use area that I'm sure you've heard about. And so what we wanted to do was to capitalize on that. And that's that area that's disproportionately used by owls during the breeding season. And it's a subset of their larger home range. And so you would have birds that would use that particular area, and that contains your nesting and roosting habitat and your foraging habitat. That mix is all usually contained within that. And so, birds, use sometimes the lower portions of the drainages, closer to streams. And then over on your right, in terms of the sites themselves, we know that birds are spatially distributed, kind of a nearest neighbor distance, and that there's high site fidelity, and then these circles here help represent kind of the 500-acre cores. And so we're bringing that all into consideration. And so back to the act itself, where we talked about you got to have the primary, or the biological features, the primary constituent elements. And then the question then becomes, okay, well, that's all well and good, but really what is essential to the conservation of the species? How do we portray that, and what do we measure that? And so that word essential is throughout the act, but unfortunately it's not really defined anywhere. And so having all the stand data, all the site data, all the landscape data, how do we go about gauging really what's essential? And so what we ended up doing is going to the recovery plan of 2011, and in there's recovery objectives and criteria. And what we wanted to know through the modeling effort, but really to gauge how well things are going in that effort, is how well distributed are the populations, how is population persistence, and how well are those populations connected. And so that kind of was how we used to help evaluate. And we use that through the HECSIM process. That was that third step I talked about earlier, and Brian will talk a little bit more about. So we were able to relativize the various scenarios in terms of how that was playing out. So what HECSIM allows us to do, and this whole process allowed us to do, was kind of quantitatively make comparisons among the different conservation scenarios. And it's a repeatable process, and so we could play it around with it quite a bit. And so we had that luxury. And so when we started running things and trying to figure out, well, really, what is the most efficient network size? How can we confer the best conservation planning? How are we meeting our critical habitat goals? And also kind of stepping back to the basis of the act and aligning that. We ended up running a bunch of what we call composite maps, and through that, we were able to kind of figure out, okay, and again, not futurizing stuff, but saying, okay, how does one planning effort, if you will, compare to the next, and what is the population persistence there? And one of the things what we tried to do after looking at the habitat aspects of it and then putting the composite maps together is that we wanted to make sure we had reliance, if you will, on the federal lands first. That is, that we wanted to try to maximize contributions of conservation to the critical habitat and recovery from spotted owls on the federal lands first, and then secondarily look at state lands and private lands after that. And so, so we only went to the state and private lands aspect of it when we found that the federal lands in a particular area were insufficient to meet those needs. And so, again, Brian's going to touch more, I think, in detail on some of that. So after we've got the PCEs and we know what's occupied and we've got the geographical distribution set, those are all provisions of the ESA and establishing critical habitat, then the question becomes, well, what are the special management considerations that influence the designation? And Paul talked a little bit about this in his opening, that the objectives of the recovery plan, first and foremost, conserve, extent high-quality habitat, and then also occupied habitat. And we need to do that because, as Betsy showed, or at least we think the 2014 data will show, that we've got declining population trends, and then we also have this barred owl threat. And so we need to be able to have these two legs of the conservation stool to help with that. As Paul also mentioned, that there's active management in some situations that we would be supporting out there. And so while you can be passive about it, the rule also talks about some active management. And we know that there are places out there where recovery of spotted owls would benefit from where the basic goals are to restore processes, restore function, and so we want to be able to do that. And then lastly, in terms of the special management, and Brendan and Bruce will probably get into this, is that we can't direct what goes on the federal lands, but our role there is to help provide technical assistance and avoid adverse modification. And to reiterate what was said earlier about critical habitat, there's the perception out there that it's hands off. You can't do anything in it. It's a large reserve, things like that, and that's not the case, And what we know, and what we've tried to articulate to folks, is that that every stand out there or every acre out there that is designated critical habitat does not necessarily have to be in suitable habitat conditions at all times, all right? Because we recognize that there's processes that go on in time and space to the forest conditions, either naturally or otherwise, that happen out there. And so that habitat has always been in flux. It's always been changing temporally. It's been changing structurally. And so the system that's out there right now, and as it's been referred to, it's large acres, large size. Part of that large size is, one, to help accommodate the natural processes that go out there. And then also, from a planning standpoint, from a landscape level standpoint that Debbie talked about, that's what we're keenly interested in, is being able to plan projects at that larger landscape, at the critical habitat landscape scale. Those projects that are strategic and well-placed, hopefully those things will help correct diminished ecological processes. And if you want to read more about kind of where the service is coming from, about some of those forest management practices that are articulated in the rule, and Paul talked earlier about Drs. Franklin and Johnson and their work. If you go to the December 2012 Journal of Forestry, some of this is outlined in there. And then last year in 2013, there's follow-up articles on some of this as well. And so I encourage you to go to the Journal of Forestry and read some of that. So kind of to tie it all together, trying again to blend what the provisions of the Act are with, state-of-the-art conservation planning. And in the recovery plan, our principles, our goals, I think are laid out really well. I think it's the best available information that allows for really great conservation biology and planning that helps shape the rule. The modeling allowed us to do two things. One is it allowed us to do a quantitative assessment of the different networks, and then it also allowed us to, again, to step through the planning process as it relates to ESA. And back to the primary physical biological features, the primary constituent elements, and so forth. And then lastly, back to the ESA Section 2 that I talked about, and conserving those ecosystems upon which species depend. I think the rule, the habitat, or the recovery plan both get at that very well. And so, so I guess the question for you is, do you think we achieve that given what we know? And so just to close out here, while I showed the title slide, there was the core group of folks that were really serving to help put things together. There was this other cast of folks here that helped get it across the finish line, and in particular Dr. Paul Henson, who never wavered, never buckled, at least I never saw, in terms of everything coming at us to make it happen. And then also you see Bob Anthony's name there, and for those of you that don't know, Bob passed away this last December, and his legacy in Oregon is really large, especially as it comes to spotted owls. And a lot of what we did built on Bob's work and his students' work, and so we want to thank Bob for his time here. Thanks. So just to preface any questions here, recognize that there'll be more in-depth conversation on the management aspects, and then more details on the modeling and the kind of the reserve design that we ended up with. So that's coming up. So I'm trying to head off questions, I guess. So. And our chief of consultation for the region is in the audience right there. So if you got those type of questions, so we'll go there.
So I have a question. You got two bullets, conserve occupied sites and conserve extant high quality habitat. In the occupied sites, often we're advocating treatment in plantations and dense homogeneous stands. There seems to be a lot of debate on what conserve high quality habitat means. Is the service advocating treating within the stands of high quality habitat, or treating around and treating other types first?
So the question is the service advocating treating in high-quality habitat, essentially? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To conserve the occupied site, you may need to do some treatment, like within, say, that core.
Yeah.
But you have used the same word conserve for high-quality habitat.
Sure.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
High-quality habitat.
In this sense, well, I don't know, are you going to touch on RA 32 and things like that, Brendan, or no? Okay, damn it. So under high-quality habitat, part of that definition would be Recovery Action 32 habitat, and I'm not sure if you know what that is. And so, my perspective on that, and from where my office comes from, is usually we would not want people to work in that RA 32 habitat unless there's a really good justification for that. And then if it's not RA 32 type habitat, but within that core area, I think there's options that can be considered in terms of where you want to do that, in terms of, and then how temporally you want to space out those particular actions. And so I would say it's not a deal breaker, but I think that it needs there's time and place considerations that happen for that. And so I know that our level 1 folks, I don't know, if you want to contradict me on that, please feel free, but go ahead.
In the modeling, I've wondered why the areas of concern, those areas we've managed for 20 years to help the birds move from the Cascades to the Coast Range?
The AOCs.
AOCs,
Yeah.
why aren't they in the model?
So the question is, under previous conservation planning for spotted owls, and I think it may have translated into Northwest Forest Plan, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that, there was areas of concern that basically were these bridge areas of habitat that were to provide connectivity, say, from the Cascades to the Coast Range. And my memory is fuzzy, I'm sorry, on how much were incorporated or not. I know that at least in Southwest Oregon, through that Applegate drainage area, I think some of that connectivity was there. If you move farther north in the Coast Range into the Coos Bay area, I think some of that was there. The particular area you mentioned, the bridge across the Kalapuya area,
Across
Cottage Grove,
That's
yeah.
not there.
Yeah, I heard that actually not too long ago that wasn't there, so I don't know. It probably comes back to, again, where do we, through the modeling portion of it, we must have believed that we could get connectivity there without having to really designate critical habitat. Because there's other overlays that are there. BLM has, GIFMA and other land use allocations there that are supposed to help provide for that.
Those areas were connectivity, at least on the Eugene.
Uh-huh.
I was just guessing, the model tended to leave out the BLM sections that are on the edge. Anyway, so the model had a little bit of a bias for connected stands, connected sections.
The model
That's
doesn't,
all I was-
there's no bias in the model. I don't know what you're talking about.
They're designed to connect, right?
We'll leave that one for Brian. If you've got any more details on that, Brian, maybe not, but,
I won't be talking about that so specifically.
okay.
But that is a good point in that where there were scattered pieces of, it doesn't matter what the ownership is, scattered little patches of habitat. The model didn't view those as positively as pieces that were larger, more connected, because fewer else
That's kind of what I
use
noticed, so
those.
at least on our resource area, the edge closest to private land, the Lamb Valley, isn't critical habitat. Like almost all those sections are not. And then the AOCs do kind of the same thing, they go edge of our BLM zone.
Thank you, Jim. So between Jim and the next couple talks, I think we'll convince you that the Fish and Wildlife Service did not pull critical habitat out of their belly button. They really did. Put a lot of work into it.